Okay, so this is part 3 in the series, Torah in its ancient Israelite context, which is my effort to take the teaching of the lost world of the Torah by Dr. John H. Walton and J. Harvey Walton and make it accessible, explain it, add some illustrations, some examples, in order to help folks understand who are interested in this topic, understand better what it meant, the Torah, what it meant to the ancient Israelites, what they would have thought of it, how they would have viewed it, how they would have used it, that sort of thing. So this is part 3. We've already had part 1 and part 2. Part 1, of course, being that it was an ancient document, which seems obvious, but we sometimes forget the disconnect between our cultural river and their cultural river. And the second one was talking about the nature of law and legislation and that sort of thing in the ancient world, particularly the ancient Near East. And so now we are continuing that thought and talking more about some of the aspects of what it means to think about law in the ancient Near East. So let's dig in. We'll see what we have here. Now, the first thought is that ancient Near Eastern legal collections existed to teach wisdom. Wisdom is a big deal here. It's part of their cultural river. It's a high value to them, and one that, of course, we sadly in the modern world gloss over quite readily. So let's see what we mean by that. Many types of ancient Near Eastern lists use the if-then formula. Now, it's not just legal lists, medical conditions, omens from the gods, if this happens then, proverbs, right? If a man does this then, lexical equivalents, in other words, things that are translating terms from different languages, and of course legal lists. A lot of them use this if-then formula because that's the way that they shared wisdom. Let's keep thinking. So these lists, here's the quote, are not intended to be comprehensive. Rather, they're what we call aspective. That is, they offer a wide variety of aspects pertaining to the topic of the list. This accumulation of aspects serves to produce a sense of understanding of the field as a whole. In a word, the accumulated aspects provide wisdom. So these lists are not meant to be comprehensive. They're not trying to cover a topic from A to Z, from start to finish. That's just not what they are. They're just a series of examples in the field that were brought together for this list, that if you take them all in, you will gain wisdom. Again, the book of Proverbs is a great example of this. All right, the book of Proverbs is not comprehensive, right? However, it has a lot of different examples about the right way of living and various situations that if you follow them, if you do things like that, it doesn't mean that it will always work out, but it means you will be living with wisdom. You will have gained wisdom and be doing the best that you can by employing it. So in the same way, the quote continues, in the same way, the lists of legal sayings provide wisdom for judges who have to decide on cases in their towns. These lists showcase the wisdom of the king to discern what justice will look like. They're not the law of the land, they're not legislative decrees, and they do not constitute a prescriptive code enforced in society. The king has not promulgated these laws. He has had them compiled to convey his wisdom, because as the king designated by the gods, his responsibility is to maintain order on behalf of the gods. Wisdom is the ability to perceive order and establish it. If you forgot or you haven't looked at part 1, one of the reasons why Walton can say that they're not this and they're not that is because, again, their cultural river, the way we know that these ideas of law and codified law and a legal code, right, a legal system, they didn't exist in this time period. They had not yet been developed as ideas, and so the Torah cannot function as something that did not yet exist in the world. He's talking in general about the ancient Near East, and all the different legal codes, Babylonian, Egyptian, Assyrian, etc., etc. We will hone in on the Torah itself here in a minute. So Just to show you an example, in the book of Leviticus, and again, these aren't all of them in Leviticus, but I just went through and picked a smattering of them spread throughout the book of Leviticus. A lot of them have that if you, if the, if they, whatever, if, and then the then comes after that. It's an example of the kind of wisdom that would lead to a good life. So, given that the ancient Near East operated this way, right, and then all of these different lists had that same goal, that same purpose to share wisdom, let's think about the Torah. The Torah is similar, not exactly the same, but similar to ancient Near East legal collections, and therefore also is teaching wisdom, not creating legislation. Again, the Israelites were similar to their neighbors. They were closer in the way that they thought, the way that they understood things to their neighbors than they are to us. We can't take modern concepts and ideas, read them into the Torah, and say that they were there all along. They wouldn't have been. You have to get into to the mindset, the way of thinking and understanding the world that was common to the ancient Near East, and say, how similar are the Israelites to that? In what ways are they different from that? And again, in this particular case, Torah is not a legislative list, because again, those didn't exist back then. It is a collection of wisdom, which is how they did these things. So let's keep looking. First, as is true for the ancient Near East legal collections, the Torah, even if, with all the collections combined, is nowhere near being comprehensive. All right, there's more than 600 laws, depending on how you count them, in the Law of Moses. But it's not a comprehensive legal system. There are all sorts of situations and areas that are not addressed or not addressed comprehensively. We'll dig into that. So those who attempted to employ it prescriptively had to do considerable extrapolation in order to produce a code that could be used as normative. This impulse is richly worked out in the Mishnah. We're going to dig into that in a minute. So the Mishnah is the oral Torah. And if you're not familiar with Mishnah and Talmud and Gemara, it can get a little bit confusing. Long story short, these are the traditions from the time of Moses to the period after the destruction of the temple, when they were all collected by that group of rabbis after the destruction of the temple in the Jamnia, and beginning in the 2nd century and going forward, and then finally collected, edited, published as a group. And this is a massive collection of opinions and understandings seeking to fill out what the Torah has to say. And in essence, it was part of that process of it becoming by what it was by the 1st century in the time of Jesus, basically a legal code. All right, again, that's in the 1st century. We're talking 1,500 years before that. So let's look at that, right? The Jewish rabbinical commentary on Sabbath keeping. I picked Sabbath keeping because it is a great example, right? It's a pretty straightforward command, right? In Genesis, and then again in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, about remembering the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, not doing any work. And there's some examples. The Mishnah and the Talmud go to great lengths to carefully define and precisely determine the observance of the Sabbath. The tractate is thus one of the longest in terms of the chapters in the Mishnah. Excuse me. And folio pages in the Talmud. It comprises 24 chapters and has a Gemara. That's a rabbinical analysis and commentary of the Mishnah. In other words, a commentary on the commentary, in both the Babylonian Talmud and all but the last 4 chapters of the Jerusalem Talmud. So the Jewish community in Babylon and the one centered in Jerusalem were both fascinated with this need and put a lot of time and effort into defining and analyzing and arguing about exactly what Sabbath observance means. And of course, Jesus in the Gospels comes right in the midst of that, right? When they say your disciples were picking grain and rubbing it in their hands so that they could eat it, and that's work, and they got after them. And of course, most famously, when he heals people on the Sabbath, and does so publicly, purposefully, on some occasions to show, no, that your understanding of the Sabbath is wrong. So what does it amount to? It's 157 pages of this commentary in the Babylonian Talmud, and 92 pages in the Jerusalem Talmud. All right, so a lot of discussion about Sabbath keeping, which all goes to the point that the original Torah, right, written by Moses, given to the generation at Sinai, they did not have a comprehensive, codified legislation. Because as you can see, in order to arrive at that kind of understanding, you would need a lot longer and a lot more developed set of laws. Torah, though clearly recognized as a document, of course it's called the Book of Moses, is not relied on as the legal normative basis for judicial decision. And I mentioned this in the previous one. Nobody is taking the Torah off the legal shelf and consulting it in order to make judgments. I'll give you three famous examples. Again, we don't have a single example. We don't have any examples in the text of Scripture of someone consulting the Torah as a judge in order to determine a punishment, in order to determine a case. That's not what they do, because that's not how it was used. That's not what it was meant to be. It was wisdom, not a codified legislation. So here's the example. When confronted with the prophet Nathan, his hypothetical, right? He comes to David and says, here's a hypothetical, because he had had adultery with Bathsheba and had her husband basically murdered. He comes to him with the story about the lamb and the neighbor taking it and killing it. It's all there in 2 Samuel 12. Very, very profound scene. Well, what does King David do? He responds with his own judgment. He doesn't say, hey, scribe, what does the law of Moses say the punishment should be? He says the man who did this must die. The law of Moses doesn't say anything about such an offense. Again, this is an offense against cultural expectations, an offense against decency and neighborliness. It's not a death penalty case. David responds without consulting the law, which certainly would not have called for the death penalty in such a case. And he didn't seek to substantiate his judgment with a text of the law. He didn't say, as it is written, let me apply this law. Here's another example. Of course, famously, Solomon, he doesn't consult Torah to arrive at a solution to the two women arguing over whose child had died in the night. Again, it's not a comprehensive legal code, but so a specific, not very common case like that is not going to be covered in it. So Solomon has to use his own wisdom. He has to draw upon the wisdom of Torah, right? He has to draw upon what he has learned from it and use his own judgment. And then, most famously, again, John chapter 8, the pericope adulterae, it's a textual variant, and if you're going to argue that it's not original to the Gospel of John, which it's probably not, but you're going to argue that it's not part of the authoritative Jesus narrative, then don't pay attention during this, but I find it very telling because nobody's objecting in the early church to say that why is Jesus doing it this way, right? Nobody is complaining about his response. So they come to him, right? The woman caught in adultery. He doesn't utilize the Torah command about adultery when he forgives the woman brought to him. Is this not a problem? If the Torah is codified legislation that one must obey every person in every case if that's what it was meant to be, then Jesus is breaking it. Because if she was caught in adultery, she should die. But he forgives her. And, obviously it is a solution to the trap that they thought they were laying for him, but it's also a different way of thinking about Torah than we in the modern world think about laws. Because, of course, Jesus was not a law breaker. He was thinking about the law of Moses differently than we do. So, most importantly, the legal sayings are presented in the context of a covenant between Yahweh and Israel, in which case they actually serve as stipulations to that covenant agreement. That's coming. It says part two. It's part two of the seminar. It's going to be in a subsequent video. We're going to really dig into the idea of the covenant stipulations of the suzerainty vassal treaty. All of that is coming later. Because previously we've been saying, what is the Torah not? It's not a codified legal system. What is it instead? It's wisdom, because that's very important in the ancient culture, very important in the ancient Near East, but it's also a covenant treaty. And so we'll dig into that more. I don't have time to go into it here. It's a whole other topic, and we want to give it its due. Another way of thinking about this, the term Torah is universally acknowledged to refer to instruction. In fact, there's no Hebrew word for law. Again, I'll let people much more versed in Hebrew than I argue about Hebrew words. But this is a basic understanding. It can be seen that the reason for this is that the ancient societies were not legislative societies. There's nothing like codified prescriptive legislation in their experience. So one of the things that we run into, of course, in English is that we use the term law and we bring with it all of the connotations of law as we understand law to be, as a code, as a legislative code enforced throughout society, no exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. That's how we think about law. When we see that word translated into English, when we see Torah as law, we're thinking of it that way. It would be more useful, but again, at this point, the ship's already sailed in church history, for it to be instruction or teaching, because that's much more akin to the idea that it would have held in Moses' day. So Old Testament usage of the Hebrew term, right? How do they use the term Torah in the Old Testament? Well, throughout the Pentateuch, the prophets, the narrative literature, even the Psalms, it is almost always used to refer to the legal cultic revelation delivered by Yahweh through Moses in association with the covenant at Sinai. In other words, it's referring back to that which God gave Moses at Sinai. It is never used to refer to decrees made by kings or priests or judges. What they decide is never referred to as Torah. Okay, so there's a disconnect between those two ideas. Now, as a footnote, that's also true because kings and priests and judges don't, in the ancient Near East, make laws. All right, royal decrees could be wisdom and instruction, but decrees are not laws. Again, they were not making laws. That's just not how the ancient Near East worked. Torah presents the way of wisdom and life. You can see that in Deuteronomy 30. In the ordered world of the covenant, we can therefore see that the issues that Scripture addresses have to do with wisdom and covenant fidelity. Those are the two, let me pause for a minute. Those are the two most important ideas by far to the ancient Israelites and to God as he is working with them in this covenant. Covenant fidelity and wisdom. Not with legislation and its rules that must be obeyed. So listen to this. There's more coming because this is the quote that someone might take out of context and not understand what Walton and I are trying to explain. Primarily Walton, but I agree with him. Wise living cannot be legislated. It's a matter of applying principles of wisdom, not of following rules. Pause for a minute. We all know this, right? We actually know this. Legalism doesn't work. All right, doesn't work for teenagers. We've all seen or at least heard about Footloose. That's not the way wisdom works. Keep going. If God did not give rules, as again in Torah, as we have suggested, there are no rules to follow. If God did not provide legislation, there are no laws to obey. Now pay particular attention to the exact words here, right? We're talking about rules and laws as we understand those concepts and as we understand those ideas. And believe me, this is not an antinomian understanding. It's an ancient one that values wisdom. And again, I have been accused of being an antinomian, which is, laughable and ridiculous, far from the truth. because I have stood up to the idea that Torah is not for all people in all places and all times. We'll deal with that more in subsequent parts to this series. It just doesn't make sense from an ancient Israelite perspective for that to be the case. That's not antinomian, because again, they were not pronomian, because they did not have laws and rules the way we in the modern world do. They valued wisdom. So order in society was the goal. And it was achieved through wisdom, which had its foundation in the fear of the Lord, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Israel's judiciary system, like that throughout the ancient Near East, was based on the wisdom of the judges, not on legislation. Again, you see this over and over in the narrative, right? That a judge, like with the case of Ruth and Boaz, he goes to the entrance to the city gate to say, here is a case. You have the right to marry her first. Let's deal with this. But again, that's being dealt with not through legislation, but through the wisdom of the judges. They trusted in the wisdom of judges. Again, it's a different way of understanding society. They believed that those who had that wisdom could be entrusted with making decisions that people would follow. We don't live like that, right? We are a much more ordered society, but that's not the way the ancient Near East worked. So the people are to heed this wisdom and preserve it. In this view, the expected response to the Torah is far different from a response to legislation. Legislation carries a sense of you ought, or you must, or you need to. Instruction carries a sense of you will know. In other words, the Torah was given by God to Israel so that they would know better, so that they would know how they should live. Not as a legislative code, because again, legislative codes did not exist in the ancient Near East. I've said that many times. Some people are going to object to that, but it's just simply there's no evidence that that's true. Those ideas developed much later in human history. So, as a caveat, that's one reason why it's incorrect to say that God taught Israel that legalism doesn't work through Torah. And I'll admit that back in my career, in my ministry, I've said things of that nature because I was thinking of Torah in legislative terms from a New Testament perspective in part. We're trying to think of it through the perspective of Moses and the Israelites in that generation and in that era. So that very concept, the whole concept of legalism did not exist in Moses's day. It would have made no sense to have a conversation about legalism with someone in the ancient Near East. No one would have understood what you're talking about. That came many centuries later, right? The New Testament has much to say on the matter. Yeah, legalism is a big deal in the New Testament, right? Paul talks about it extensively, and we'll return to that idea a little bit in part 9. But that's 1,500 years from when Moses came. And again, 1,500 years is a long time ago, right? 1,500 years ago, Rome had just fallen. The Dark Ages were dawning. The Black Plague was coming. The barbarians were invading. That was a very different world than the one we live in now. You can't take ideas from our world and put them in theirs. It just doesn't work. And this is our last slide, so we'll wrap it up with this. So here's an analogy. The best practices in a given field are wisdom, not rules and laws. Those who are wise within that field follow them, not because they must do so, but because they aim to do their best and recognize the value of the wisdom of their colleagues. So again, I was a teacher, public school teacher for a decade, and educational field is all about best practices. What is the best way to teach mathematics in elementary school? What is the best way to teach reading in the middle school, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about best practices, and there's all sorts of books and conferences and trainings that you have to be a part of, sometimes endlessly, that are all about best practices. But but that's not about what you must do. That's about what works best And then you have to say to yourself, well, what works in my setting? And again, that was very evident to me. I taught alternative ed in a small setting, right? Only a few students who had difficult life situations. I was not going to teach them like a AP advanced English class, right? That would have been foolish of me. It would not have been wise. So you have to be able to take wisdom. And again, that's what Torah is all about, instilling wisdom in the Israelites, along with, of course, the covenant stipulations, and we'll get to that in a subsequent thing. So again, if you got questions, you're not quite sure what Walton's trying to say here, number one answer would be read the book. You can also comment, and we will dialogue and hopefully come to a better understanding. The idea of rules and laws, again, it's not antinomian. They're just not concepts that were in existence when the Torah was given, which leads us to say it was something else. And what else it was wisdom, which meant a whole lot to the people in the ancient Near East. All right, so that's this section. Hope it's helpful to you. God bless.